there's hundreds of targets that they could go after. I mean, key for them will be things that like logistics depots, supply anywhere where there's something that the Russians need for supplying their troops on the front line. Anywhere that there's ammunition, fuel supplies. There's also the airfields where there's been aircraft flying out of, and they've been obviously using these sort of awful glide bombs to hit Ukrainian cities and kill civilians. And so if they can go after these aircraft and the airfields, the Russians will then be forced to move these aircraft away from further away from the front line. And then they're not going to have enough fuel for them to get to sort of targets deeper inside Ukraine. And so they're going to be carrying out less sorties. So overall, I think the Ukrainians believe that using these long-range weapons could be quite a game changer for them.
Great. Well, first off, Larisa, obviously Ukraine has been calling for the use of Storm Shadow missiles, long-range missiles, inside Russia for some time. Why does it appear that the US and the UK are changing their positions now?
I think there's a few things, but I think the main thing for the Americans is that Russia has just received a shipment of more than 200 ballistic missiles from Iran, and that is going to enable Russia to hit targets deeper inside Ukraine. And of course, Zelensky has been saying, well, we need to do the same. And now Russia's got the support of Iran in this way. I think it's sort of focused minds in America and Britain. And obviously they said, the top diplomats in both countries said just this week that was obviously at the forefront of their mind when these discussions have been taking place.
Does that almost make it easier to justify politically? Because previously the fear was if you gave Ukraine these long-range weapons and said you can use them inside Russia, that could be seen as an escalation. But if Russia's already getting ballistic missiles from Iran, it's less of an escalation, it's more a response.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And we heard from David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, yesterday. They gave this press conference in Kyiv. And they said there that Putin was to blame for escalating the crisis. And that was because he had received this weapons shipment from Iran. And yes, so it's looking like, therefore, that the US and Britain could respond by allowing Ukraine to use their long-range missiles inside Russia.
You mentioned the meeting between Blinken and Lammy yesterday in Kyiv. Are we expecting a formal announcement about this when Joe Biden meets with Keir Starmer at the White House tomorrow?
I don't think so. I mean, we had this meeting yesterday. Blinken and Lammy both met with President Zelensky, and Blinken said that he was going to take all the operational details about loosening these restrictions on Storm Shadow and various other missiles back to Joe Biden ahead of this meeting in Washington on Friday. And of course, Joe Biden and Keir Starmer are going to discuss this, as well as look at the wider strategy on Ukraine and what happens next. But I don't think we're going to see an announcement tomorrow. From what I've heard, I think that Biden's going to take some time to discuss the issue with other European leaders. And then towards the end of this month, the 22nd of September, we're going to have a meeting of world leaders at the UN. So I think that, everything's sort of working up to this 22nd of September date. Also, what's quite significant is President Zelensky has said that around that time, he'll be presenting his victory plan to Joe Biden. And that will obviously look at how Ukraine forces Putin to give up his war. And I'm sure the use of long-range missiles inside Russia is going to be a huge part of that.
Could there be a kind of quid pro quo here? I mean, the UK government very recently announced a suspension of some arms sales to Israel. Might the US say, look, we will allow British Storm Shadow missiles to be used inside Russia as long as you then lift those restrictions you've recently placed?
I don't think that's going to happen, no. I think, we've announced that arms embargo already. Obviously, the Americans didn't want it to happen, but I can't see those two being linked at all. The Americans aren't going to sort of join those policies up. The Americans are going to do what they think is the right move on the battlefield. And so far, they've been wary about doing this and allowing Ukraine to fire these missiles inside Russia because they are concerned about escalation. There's obviously this huge fear that, if Ukraine does do this and starts firing at these airfields inside Russia, will Putin respond by using nuclear weapons? Then that obviously it becomes a huge red line for NATO. Then there's obviously going to be discussion about what NATO does in response. And then you can just see all of this escalating into this sort of terrifying spiral where you could end up with a third world war. And that's what everybody is extremely keen to avoid.
Do you think the West, and particularly the US, are slightly less worried about Putin escalating, given Ukraine has now invaded Kursk, it's literally invaded Russia, and it hasn't prompted the worst case scenario?
Yes, that is the second key point, apart from the Iranian ballistic missile shipment. Yes, so basically, because Ukraine has gone into Kursk, they've gone into Russian territory, and Russia hasn't really done anything in response. And I think that's kind of emboldened the Ukrainians, but also sent a message to Britain and the Americans that actually maybe we don't need to be so fearful about Putin's response, and actually is it better now to help the Ukrainians in the best way that we can do so we can bring a swift end to the war.
And just on the Storm Shadows themselves, how exactly would Ukraine want to use them in Russia? What kind of targets would they be attacking?
There's hundreds of targets that they could go after. I mean, key for them will be things that like logistics depots, supply anywhere where there's something that the Russians need for supplying their troops on the front line. Anywhere that there's ammunition, fuel supplies. There's also the airfields where there's been aircraft flying out of, and they've been obviously using these sort of awful glide bombs to hit Ukrainian cities and kill civilians. And so if they can go after these aircraft and the airfields, the Russians will then be forced to move these aircraft away from further away from the front line. And then they're not going to have enough fuel for them to get to sort of targets deeper inside Ukraine. And so they're going to be carrying out less sorties. So overall, I think the Ukrainians believe that using these long-range weapons could be quite a game changer for them.
And just finally, Larissa, are we purely talking about the Storm Shadows, or would Ukraine want to have access to other Western-supplied long-range weapons?
They've got Storm Shadows, which are most likely in quite limited supply, but they've also got weapons, ballistic missiles from the Americans that can hit targets a bit further away than the Storm Shadow. So they'll be wanting to use those. Obviously, Germany has been under huge pressure to supply their Taurus missiles. They're similar to Storm Shadow, but the big point here is that Germany's got around 600 of those. The Ukrainians really want them, but the Germans have refused to hand them over. I can't really see that changing, but I think what we're mainly talking about is the American weapons, the American long-range missiles.